Well, let's get started. It's time again for another conversation where we look at the recap of last week's sermon, actually this past Sunday's sermon from November the 25th, as we continue our series looking and studying through the book of Exodus and talking about redemption and where redemption comes from. That redemption has to have a source, a redeemer who brings it forward. And we talked about who he is as God, who is the Redeemer. We've been talking about what he does to bring about redemption, why he does these things as he declares himself, not as us theorizing what he has said about bringing redemption. And as we look at the book of Exodus, we're looking specifically at how God delivered the children, the families of Israel who were enslaved in Egypt, and delivered them out of captivity, and had made a promise to them to bring about their redemption, to deliver their rescue, to give them a home, to give them a relationship with himself, and to be their God and them be his people. There would be this not only awesome rescue, but this incredible God-gifted relationship, this act of grace and his glory and goodness to the people. So we've been looking at a few areas of that. In the areas of redemption, we've been talking about the oppression that the Israelites faced as slaves, and how drastic and terrible that looked. We looked at how God made himself known to Moses, that as Redeemer, he wasn't doing this offhanded or distant. He was being very close in bringing about himself in a very personal way, in a very potent way, and powerful way. We looked at the confrontation of how all of this came to be whenever God would face Pharaoh, that Moses would face Pharaoh, and God would be the ultimate victor, using Moses as his means. Even though he didn't need to have to use Moses, he chose to out of his grace. So we've been looking at those areas. Then last week we talked about the plagues, these judgments, these strikes that happened against Egypt, and how even all of those, they were an act of God's benevolent power on demonstration. It was on display so that we'd see that even in the middle of these incredible warnings and these really terrible plagues, from our perspective, God was showing his graciousness and his goodness in a way that made his name glorious, in a way that others would see that God did not just act haphazardly, but God gave people time to respond, and if they did not choose to do so, then that they at least received the warning, that is, received the notice of what God was about to do. So we talked about looking at those plagues when we were looking at Exodus chapters 7 through 11. We were looking at the plagues and how you go from, first of all, these distressful plagues like the Nile River turning to blood, the plague of the frogs, which it just tells me God has a sense of humor. It's funny in its own way. The plague of gnats, some translate that as lice, some translate that as mosquitoes. Either way, terrible pest. But then they went from distressful to painful, costly plagues. You had the plagues of the flies, and you had the plagues of the boils, and then the plagues of the livestock, all of them taking place. And then they went from the painful into what we would call the mournful. I mean, the kind that make you cry, the kind that make you terrified, the kind that will make you mourn. And we see this in the utter darkness. We see this in the locust swarms. We see this in the hailstorm. And then we see this finally in the plague of the death of the firstborn. And then that God does not, we cannot say that God is not gracious. That might have been a double negative, but I'm not the grammar police. What we see is that God demonstrates his grace by not starting with the heaviest of all of them first. But then even in the plague of the firstborn, the death of the firstborn, that 10th plague that is probably the far most memorable of all of them, God gives us a reminder that in the middle of this, even in the middle of this, he is gracious, And he does provide a means of that grace to be delivered to his people, a means of rescue, even in the middle of something so huge. And so I think all of us could use a reminder from every now and then. I know I need to write things down all the time. I carry my little list, and I put it on my phone, and I need the alarms to tell me, hey, this is coming up. I don't know, maybe it's just a part of getting a little older, and I'm not even that old yet, so I'm really going to write stuff down later on in life. But the Bible is also an incredible reminder. It reminds us once again who God is. And like when we're talking about God, we're not talking about somebody puny or even limited by humanity. We're talking about the utmost, the omnipotent one, the all-knowing one, the ever-present one, the one who began it all, from whom all things exist, the meaning of it all, the giver of truth for it all. I mean, we're talking about every single issue of significance going back to God. So the Bible gives us that reminder of who he is, but it also lets us know that this God is not silent, that he's said something. And in those saying, those words, it's demonstrating his character, it's demonstrating his holiness and his attributes, but it's also demonstrating his grace, his activity towards man. And that's just huge. But it's also showing us what he's done and also what he calls us to do. So we're going to look at a couple of reminders really quick. It's more than actually a couple, so you'll have to stay with me, that show some things about what God was doing. We recapped those from the sermon on November the 25th. If you want to go back and check it out, you're more than welcome to. We have it on Facebook Live, facebook.com/Eastgate BC, if you want to ever check us out. But here are some reminders. I have 10 of them. Okay, I know, I'm crazy. A 10-point reminder recap. I think we can do this. First of all, we see the Redeemer's statement. Once again, we're reminded that God did not just throw this plague, this strikeout without warning. He demonstrated grace. He demonstrated resolve to show his care and his kindness and his hope for humans' response. He knew what they would do as God, but he was giving their will, their response from themselves to respond to his statement. And so he gives this statement in Exodus chapter 11. We're looking at Exodus 11 through 13 right now. And so we see his statement. This just goes back to point that God does things and gives us time. Some people think God is so drastic, and God is holy and just and to the utmost. He is righteous. He is the definition of righteousness. And God has the authority as the creator of all to do with his creation as he wills. We don't have that authority. We can't be like, hey, I am a soup bowl, you're the potter. I'd rather you do this. No, we don't. We can't talk back. It doesn't make sense for us to feel like we have that right to do so, but God does hear his people. But what we see is God gives the statement. He said, I'm giving the opportunity, I'm demonstrating my sovereignty, no doubt, but I'm giving the opportunity for your responsibility to take place. Second reminder we see is God's security. God tells the people of Israel in the middle of this, after he tells them about the plague that's coming, he's saying, hey, I'm changing your calendar. This is going to be a new year for you. In just saying this is going to be a new year, guess what he's saying? Life is going to keep going. Life is going to keep, assuring you of rescue. I'm assuring you of salvation and security. We said in chapter 12, verse 1. We also see in that chapter 12, verse 1 and 2, we see the Redeemer's, another reminder, the Redeemer's schedule. That all of a sudden, God is setting up the schedule for the people of Israel, saying this is going to be your new year. It's going to set a standard for security of my peace, that I'm going to continue preserving and bringing about my promise for life to you. I'm going to use you as my means, that line that's going to bring ultimately that Redeemer, that full redemption provision through Jesus Christ. I'm going to do that. But in the meantime, I'm setting up a new schedule for you. Your very new year, your very calendar is going to remind you, the very beginning, I am the Lord. I am your Redeemer. I rescued you from slavery. I called you and restored you into a place as my people. It's going to set a new schedule. Like the whole mindset and life cycle has been transformed. And God does that for us. God, when we encounter him, it can't help but affect our view of his words, his statements. It can't help but affect our view of security and our peace that we have in him, but it also can't help but affect our schedule. It's going to change how we view what we do with this life in these days and how they're meant to point back to him. But then we see a fourth reminder, we see the Redeemer's stipulations. God set certain patterns for the people that he was going to provide a way and a means of grace, but they had to follow in obedience to his direction. And they couldn't just come up with their own idea. They couldn't just come up with their own plan, something that sounded right or felt right in the moment. They must follow God's laid out order. He gets to call the shots. Same thing is true for us. God sets the stipulations. And honestly, we probably would not ever come up with these ways on our own. But that's what makes them so grand and so awesome when we think about what God did to bring us back to him. Fifth, we see the Redeemer's supply. This is a fifth reminder that God told them to take a 1-year-old male goat or sheep. This was something they had about. This was something near to them. They didn't have to go climb a high mountain to find a high flower that was super rare, and then find the rare animal that eats the rare flower, and then find the rare bug that's somewhere on the rare animal that eats the rare flower on that mountain that they had to climb, and then take that rare bug off that rare animal that eats that rare flower, bring it down off that mountain, and then do some kind of miraculous thing with it. No, he brought something very near and supplied that they already had for them, and used that as his means of sharing grace. This 1-year-old lamb. And so we see the Redeemer's supply. It's a reminder that God has not made these stipulations of us too far beyond us. They're very present. When we talk about what God has done to supply us with Jesus, that is something that is available to all. It is based on his one complete work on the cross that was once and for all times, and it's a supply that's available to all. God is not asking us, inviting us to go on this huge quest that he might be appeased. He's saying, no, I've already provided the necessary atonement. I've already provided the necessary substitution for you to have redemption, to exchange in your place for your sinfulness and debt of death. I give you the gift of life. We also see the Redeemer's service, that all of a sudden God is telling them that in their new schedule, in these stipulations, there's going to be an ongoing activity of service. There's going to be a life that overflows out of gratitude and in honor of God. But it's also going to be held in a certain way, in a certain manner. Once again, it's not just meant to come up and fly by the seat of your pants on what you're meant to do. Our worship is ordained by God in a way that honors him. A seventh reminder, we see the Redeemer's strike. Once again, God is not loose with his promises. He's not loose with his pronouncements. He's not loose with his justice. He will bring his justice in the way that he has declared. And make no mistake, he had declared it against Egypt for their heinous atrocities against the people of Israel and their fellow man, for their heinous atrocities against life by having infants drowned and killed in the Nile River. God brings the death of the firstborn. And we see God is not unjust. God is not unjust here. I may be using a lot of double negatives. I really apologize. But God is bringing retribution. He is bringing back a strike, a reckoning for what was done. And make no mistake, God sees the oppression of the oppressor. He sees the abuse that the abused face. And he is not just merely interested in the righteous spiritual areas. He sees what goes on in our world, and he does call into account every word or deed. He does that. And in this moment, he had pronounced a strike, and it happened. It came about. But in the middle of that strike, we see the eighth reminder. We see the Redeemer's salvation, how this blood of a lamb that was put on the doorpost, an act of faith, was demonstrated on the doorpost. And because of that, death passed over and life was provided for those that had the seal and the sign of blood. It was an activity of atonement and covering so that God would pass over those wages of death, those wages of sin. And anyone that had demonstrated their faith in God based on who he is and what he had said, he provided salvation. The same thing is true today, that God says, based on what people do when they trust in my Son, when they see that I am a holy God who sees the offense of sin, and I've provided a supply, a substitution by the only sufficient one, who is Jesus, based on their trust in me, their personal responsibility, I change their eternity. I give them life instead of death. I change the default of hell to heaven. I change the default of curse into blessing. I change your life. Not only the destination, but the direction and how it's lived. I bring salvation. And all of this points back. Why does God do this? Because, one, it brings us back again to acknowledging his splendor, his glory, that he is the one worthy of worship, and that all of this service, all this significance, it was meant to bring back honor to the Lord, that these false deities that it had infused the people of Israel, that had taken ownership, and people had said that was the only way of worship in the land of Egypt, he was showing that he is far above, more holy than anything that was ever worshipped, and he is far more the living God over these stone, deaf, dead, blind, immovable, untouching, unfeeling idols. That he is the one true God. And this was meant to demonstrate his splendor, that he is a giver of grace, he's a demonstrator of glory, he provides a means for good news, for the gospel, and he brings about good, but he will by no means leave the guilty unpunished. And then lastly, what's the last reminder in God providing all this substitutionary work in the Passover? Is the significance that seeing this act of God's grace that happened in the Bible, it would be passed on. It would be passed on through the service and activity of the families. It would be passed on by the marking of the calendar. It would be passed on by them observing what they were doing in their new land. It would be passed on in the Sabbath day worship. It would be passed on that this, we would understand that we have a calling to take what we know of the Redeemer and let others know of it. Our children, our families, our co-workers, the stranger that comes to our land, no matter where they are, they have a need to hear about his grace, about his goodness, about his gospel, about his glory. And we must carry on sharing that just as God provided a supply for us to be saved, we know that was not of our own accord, it was not of our own merit. And just as God has done for us, we must freely do to give to others. We can't provide that salvation, but we can certainly proclaim it, because only God provides it, but he has called us to be his proclamators, his proclaimers. Proclamators may not be a word either, but that's going to be about it for the conversation today. Hey, you may have questions. Please follow us find me on Facebook, connect with me through YouTube. I'll try to get back with you if you have questions. If you're in the Flint area and looking for a home church, we would love to welcome you here at Eastgate Baptist Church on Atherton Road. You can look us up at eastgatebaptist.org. We have our worship gathering at 11 a.m. every Sunday morning. We welcome you. Hey, it's almost Christmas time, and we're going to be celebrating all kinds of things with Christmas season, talking about God providing supply for us. That's what the Christmas story is all about. So if you have time, check us out at Eastgate. If you're in the area, please come visit us, connect with us. I'd love to meet you. My name is Pastor Jerome. It's been another conversation, and I hope to dialogue with you further again next week. God bless.